You probably associate the name Carcosa with Robert W. Chambers. In this, the first of two videos about Carcosa, I will discuss what Carcosa is according to the stories of Robert W. Chambers in his 1895 anthology The King in Yellow, discuss the work of Ambrose Bierce, from which Chambers got the name Carcosa, the potential influence of Florentine Knights by Heinrich Heine. I'll also discuss Carcosa in the work of Robin D. Laws, who I regard as, at least literarily, the inheritor of a certain sort of take on the place. I'll also mention my 3 favorite versions of Carcosa in contemporary fiction. And finally, I'll tell you my version of that realm. Welcome to PhD&D, everyone. I'm Dr. Bowers, and I'm here to tell you about Carcosa, Lost Carcosa. Indeed, if you're reading the work of Robert W. Chambers, you probably don't see the name Carcosa without the word lost somewhere nearby. It seems that the fact that Carcosa is lost is indeed the most important thing about it. And anyone who reads The King in Yellow in one way or another becomes obsessed with and interested in Carcosa. It's also suggested in The Court of the Dragon that Carcosa becomes interested in the readers, too. So when you read The King in Yellow, you become obsessed with this place called Carcosa, and it's a lost place. Lost. What is it exactly? Well, we learn from the opening poem, which purports to be a section from the text within a text, the forbidden stage play The King in Yellow, that Carcosa has twin suns that sink behind a lake that features cloud waves. So there must be at least 2 suns in Carcosa, and when they set, or whenever they sink, as it were, it's into a horizon that includes bodies of water with cloud waves. So either there are oceans of cloud, or oceans of liquid that have perpetual steam or cloud-like emanations coming out of them. We are also told that black stars rise in the night in Carcosa. Black stars, interesting. You might be wondering, well, wait a minute, if outer space is black, if the night is already black, how could you even tell that the stars were there if they were black too? And thus you have many visual artistic interpretations and textual ones which say that the sky of Carcosa is itself some other color. We also learn that strange moons circle in the skies. So not only does Carcosa have 2 suns, it also has multiple moons that circle in the skies. And we learn from In the Court of the Dragon that at least one of those moons is so low as to be called the moon and to be drenched with sea spray. The idea of one moon being uniquely close comes up in earlier sections as well, when we read about how in Carcosa, towers rise behind the moon. Imagine the moon being so close that the skyscraper of, the Empire State Building was behind it. How eerie and strange. Indeed, one of the reasons why I think Chambers' early stories in The King in Yellow were subsumed into the tradition of cosmic horror is because you have this alien description of Carcosa. So Carcosa is a place with black stars, 2 suns, multiple moons, at least one of which is close enough to be drenched by the sea spray and to have towers rise behind it. And so it is certainly otherworldly. Whether it's just another planet among the Hyades, which also get mentioned in Chambers' early stories, or whether it's an entire universe utterly, on account of having stars of a different color, have both been explored by contemporary writers since. In Chambers' work, we get the opening description of Carcosa in that poem, and then Hildred Castaigne makes reference to Carcosa in The Repairer of Reputations. In that story, Hildred strangely describes himself as descended from Carcosa, as well as being royalty, indeed, royalty of whatever lineage would constitute regency in the King in Yellow's royal title. This suggests the idea that Carcosa was some kind of kingdom before it was lost. And since kingdoms are ruled by kings, it would suggest that the King in Yellow ruled Carcosa? We get all that just from that first story. Later stories make scant reference to Carcosa, but it's not until In the Court of the Dragon when someone actually goes there. And this is the only moment in Chambers' entire anthology when the King in Yellow, the monstrous entity, actually appears. I crept to the door. The organ broke out overhead with a blare. A dazzling light filled the church, blotting the altar from my eyes. The people faded away. The arches, the vaulted roof vanished. I raised my seared eyes to the fathomless glare, and I saw the black stars hanging in the heavens, and the wet winds from the lake of Hali chilled my face. And now, far away, over leagues of tossing cloud waves, I saw the moon dripping with spray, and beyond, the towers of Carcosa rose behind the moon. Death, and the awful abode of lost souls, whither my weakness long ago had sent him, and changed him for every other eye but mine. And now I heard his voice, rising, swelling, thundering through the flaring light, and as I fell, the radiance increasing, poured over me in waves of flame. Then I sank into the depths, and I heard the King in Yellow whispering to my soul, "It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God." That's some really powerful prose, and I think it's a perfect ending to that story. Death and the awful abode of lost souls. This, plus some influences that we're about to talk about, plus the idea that the shadow of men's thoughts lengthen and linger in Carcosa, give this impression that Carcosa is a spiritual realm, maybe an afterlife realm, some other realm that's not only alien, but also metaphysically important. When you consider that alongside the consideration that Carcosa is lost, you begin to get some ideas for at least why I have interpreted it as a lost version of heaven, but more on that later. In Chambers, Carcosa is this other world that you become obsessed with, where people's thoughts lengthen, where it's an abode of lost souls as well as death. There are black stars, 2 suns, multiple moons, one of which is close enough to get hit by the sea's waves, and to have towers rise behind it, and it's all lost. Lost. According to the opening poem, Casilda is someone singing about how it's lost, so presumably she's singing just as it is about to be lost, or as it is being lost, or maybe after it was lost? Accordingly, since Casilda talks to Camilla in the other fragment that Chambers presents to us at the beginning of the Mask, we may well assume that Camilla is also present either right before, during, or right after the loss of Carcosa. And since the apparent revelation from the stranger that he wears no mask, i.e. that he's a monster hiding in plain sight at a masquerade, is also a horrible truth, indeed, a horrible truth as horrible as Carcosa being lost, this gives us this image that Carcosa is some metaphysical, otherworldly realm that was lost or destroyed at exactly a moment when it was announced by a stranger wore no mask. The King in Yellow was either the ruler of Carcosa or the destroyer of Carcosa, or both, maybe the same person as the stranger, maybe not. I think all of these details are left vague by Chambers in order to get us to focus on certain sorts of themes and moods, rather than in pulpy world-building details. Now, Chambers famously got the name Carcosa from Ambrose Bierce's short story, An Inhabitant of Carcosa, and Tale Foundry on YouTube has famously done a video talking about that. I'll just re-paraphrase the story here by saying that An Inhabitant of Carcosa is the story of somebody who is trying to find the lost city of Carcosa, a legend, some sort of paradise where he's destined to be. And nobody can recognize him, and he's lost in a landscape that is mist-swept and festooned with all kinds of ruins and little stone monuments. And he soon learns that he is dead, he has nowhere to go, and Carcosa is long gone. It's a beautiful, weird tale as well as a ghost story, and it raises this captivating question. What if you died and went to the afterlife destination and they were closed? What if the afterlife was gone? What if the afterlife was missing? Or worse, what if the afterlife were lost? Carcosa is horrifying, I think, because it's a blank space where heaven should be. In this way, it's both ideal, i.e. heaven, but also unattainable, i.e. lost. Lost Carcosa is an unattainable ideal, or at least that's one thing you may take away from An Inhabitant of Carcosa, and one thing I think Chambers took away when he was using the name. But that's not the only source worth mentioning. In his annotations to The King in Yellow, Kenneth Hite mentioned Florentine Knights by Heinrich Heine. Heine was, of course, a great romantic poet and writer, and in Florentine Knights, a work with which Chambers was probably familiar, we get a very striking and familiar description. At other times, when Paganini began to play, a gloom came before the listener's eyes. The sounds were not transformed into bright forms and colors. The master's form was clothed in gloomy shades, out of the darkness of which his music moaned in the most piercing tones of lamentation. Only at times, when a little lamp that hung above cast its sorrowful light over him, could Heine catch a glimpse of his pale countenance, on which the youth was not yet extinguished. His costume was singular, in two colors, yellow and red. Heavy chains weighed upon his feet. Behind him moved a face whose physiognomy indicated a lusty goat nature, and he saw at times long, hairy hands seize assistingly the strings of violin on which Paganini was playing. Then a rush of agonizing sounds came from the violin, and a fearful groan, and a sob such as was never heard upon the earth before, nor will perhaps be heard on the earth again, unless in the valley of Jehoshaphat, when the colossal trumpets of doom shall ring out, and the naked corpses shall crawl forth from the grave to abide their fate. But the agonized violinist suddenly made one stroke of the bow, such a mad, despairing stroke that his chains fell rattling from him, and his mysterious assistant and the other foul mocking forms vanished. Again, the master musician and his surroundings scarcely be recognized in the monk's brown dress, which concealed rather than clothed him. With savage countenance, half hid by the cowl, waist girt with a cord, and bare feet, Paganini stood, a solitary, defiant figure, on a rocky prominence by the sea, and played his violin. But the sea became red and redder, and the sky grew paler, till at last the surging water looked like a bright scarlet blood, and the sky above became of a ghastly corpse-like color, and the stars came out large and threatening, and those stars were black, black as glooming coal. But the tones of the violin grew ever more stormy and defiant, and the eyes of the terrible player sparkled with such a scornful lust of destruction, and his thin lips moved with such a horrible haste, that it seemed as if he murmured some old accursed charm to conjure the storm and loose the evil spirits that lie imprisoned in the abysses of the sea. Often when he stretched his long, thin arms from the broad monk's sleeve and swept the air with his bow, he seemed like some sorcerer who commands the elements with his magic wand. And then there was a wild wailing from the depth of the sea, and the horrible waves of blood sprang up so fiercely that they almost besprinkled the pale sky and black stars with crashing, as if the world were falling into fragments, and ever more stubbornly the monk played his violin. He seemed as if, by the power of violent will, he wished to break the 7 seals wherewith Solomon sealed the iron vessels in which he had shut up those vanquished demons. The wise king sank those vessels in the sea, and Heine seemed to hear the voices of the imprisoned spirits while Paganini's violin growled in its most wrathful bass. But at last he thought he heard the jubilee of deliverance, and out of the red billows of blood emerged the heads of fettered demons, monsters of legendary horror, crocodiles with bats' wings, snakes with stags' horns, monkeys with shells on their heads, seals with long patriarchal beards, women's faces with breasts in place of cheeks, green camels, heads, hermaphrodites of impossible combination, all staring with cold, crafty eyes, and with long, fin-like claws grasping at the fiddling monk. From the latter, however, in the furious zeal of his conjuration, the cowl fell back, and the curly hair, fluttering in the wind, fell round his head in ringlets like a black snake. Delightful, no? That's Florentine Knights by Heinrich Heine. It's a vivid fantasy horror description of Paganini the violinist, one famously reputed to have sold his soul to the devil for his talents, playing in some kind of magical ritual, apparently to keep the devil and his minions at bay, but which, at the very height of its efficacy, seems to summon the presence of hell itself, with a sprawling ocean of blood and demons coming out of it, and then a bone-white sky bespeckled with black stars hanging low. Cosmic, psychedelic, amazing, and also really similar to Carcosa, no? And it's not just the similarity with which one makes the case that this may be an influence, that is. It's the idea that Heine was a popular writer who Chambers would have, at least according to Haidt's annotations, read at the time. So yes, Chambers got the name Carcosa from Ambrose Bierce. And perhaps he thought of black stars on his own, there's no reason why he couldn't. But there's also this striking image from Florentine Knights of a bone-white sky with black stars summoned by magical ritual that he probably read. Now, since the influence of August Derleth and the role-playing game hobby generally on the work of Robert W. Chambers, and we'll get to all of that later, it has been popular to represent Carcosa as the stuff of alien pulp horror. That is to say, Carcosa is like Dimension X that the enemy aliens are coming from to invade us. The King in Yellow is some kind of manual or ritual book that opens up a gate to their world and ours, etc., etc. That's pretty fun. I think that's cool. It's not the only way to interpret Carcosa, but if you're interested in reading literature that embellishes that idea and builds on Chambers in that direction, I would recommend the work of Robin D. Laws, New Tales of the Yellow Sign especially, but there's also 2 novels, Fifth Imperative and The Missing and the Lost. I would say check out New Tales of the Yellow Sign, read the short stories The Dog and A Boat Full of Popes. And if you like that setting and that take on Carcosa, then you should definitely check out the novels. I think Laws makes some really interesting and fun tributes to Chambers in his own embellishment of Carcosa as an evil alien Dimension X type place that others are coming from to try to usurp us. But I'd also like to mention 3 other works of contemporary fiction. 2 of them are in that 2021 anthology released by Hippocampus Press, Under Twin Suns, Alternate Histories of the Yellow Sign. And the first is John Langan's excellent tale, Helioforge. We're going to talk about the Repairer of Reputations in its own video, but one of the things that comes up in the Repairer of Reputations that recurs in King in Yellow fiction and fan fiction and attempts to build on the mythos is the idea of alternate history, and especially alternate US history. History where things went bonkers and magic got involved and Carcosa got involved. John Langan's story Helioforge is in that tradition, but he really runs with his own ideas and it's cool. I really want to read the parallel history version of Jack Kerouac, for instance, and his version of Carcosa is something like a train yard. An interdimensional train yard? You'll have to read it. It's really cool, though. As is Sarah Reed's The Inn of the Fates. I think The Inn of the Fates by Sarah Reed really embellishes the view of Carcosa that Ambrose Bierce presents to us. That it's this kind of wispy fictional place where you're supposed to finally arrive and groove, you know? Like the afterlife is supposed to satisfy in some satiating kind of final way. You're supposed to arrive there and it's like, well, I'm done. But Carcosa is lost. There's nothing. Heaven is closed. And in Sarah Reed's story, we get somebody who just can't accept that he's there for good. That is to say, forever. Indeed, one of the things I really liked about this story is that it sharply reminded me of one of my earliest nightmares. Not my very earliest, but one of my earliest. Where, for whatever reason, I dreamed I had died and gone to heaven. And it wasn't that heaven was bad. It was just that there were other things I loved and wanted to be in touch with, and so I tried to leave. And the horror was more like if you leave, everything is gone forever, right? Like if you leave, you're dead, so it's not like you'll be able to be with those people and things you want to be with, but also you're shut out of here forever. And I chose to leave anyway, and then I kind of like woke up as I was being banished. Anyway, Sarah Reed's The Inn of the Fates feels very dreamlike, and I really like it, and it's one of my favorite views of Carcosa in the Ambrose Bierce style tradition. And I'd also like to give commendation to Haley Piper in her novel A Game in Yellow. I'm going to spoil one of the most clever and fun things about the novel, so if you want to avoid spoilers, like, click ahead for like 3 minutes. Like, this will only take a second, but in Haley Piper's A Game in Yellow, she takes the opening poem, which says, "Stranger still is lost Carcosa," and she just puts it side by side with that excerpt at the beginning of The Mask, where the stranger says, "I wear no mask." putting two and two together, we get the idea that stranger, that is, the stranger, is Carcosa. Carcosa is the stranger. Is that silly? Well, it could be if you didn't do exactly what Hailey Piper did in this novel, which is genius. But anyway, Hailey Piper also has a very clever take on Carcosa that I have to recommend while we're doing some discussion of Carcosa. More soon. But finally, before we adjourn, I would be remiss if I didn't mention my own version of Carcosa, which I have written about in the lore section for my RPG 5 Acts The King in Yellow, which was successfully backed on Kickstarter not long ago, and which at least everyone in the US has already received, both in physical copy and in PDF form. In my version of Carcosa, I take very seriously both Bierce's idea that Carcosa is a blank space where heaven should be, as well as the themes in Chambers, which suggest that Carcosa is some kind of lost perfection, lost ideal, something that we would reach for, but it's just gone. 2 and 2 make 4? For me, and for this game, Carcosa is heaven. Like, in the theological sense, in the afterlife destination sense, like full of saints and God's throne sense, except it's destroyed. It's been demolished. It's in ruins. All of the angels are dead, and their undead forms are horrific. There are also other things in the wreckage of heaven, which arise like maggots in rotten meat. So do these worms of Carcosa arise in heaven's wreckage. And worst of all is God's own undead form. Zombie God! Ghost God! I kid and I diminutize, but under our game's interpretation and my fictional interpretation, the King in Yellow is God's undead corpse. And this is in a universe that assumes monotheism is true, or was true. It's the ultimate nightmare of Chambers, the theological optimist. Chambers, who believed in das Wahre, das Schöne und das Gute, the true, the good, and the beautiful. My version of Carcosa is anti-heaven, my version of the King in Yellow is anti-God, and my monsters in my game are anti-angels. Which is a direct reference to The Conqueror Worm by Edgar Allan Poe. As are the worms. And why is heaven destroyed? Why is heaven in ruins? Why is God dead? What happened? Well, as far as the game is concerned, it's probably something you did. But as far as the literary interpretation is concerned, check out my video on the Phantom of Truth. In the meantime, thank you very much for watching. If you're watching this video on Patreon, especially, thank you very, very much. I'm currently struggling to bring these videos to you, and your support means a great deal. If you're watching these videos on YouTube, just know that you could watch a bunch of them early for just a few bucks per month on Patreon, link in the doobly-doo. Also, if you like this shirt, I designed it, and you can buy one, link in the doobly-doo. Thank you again, and have you found the yellow sign?